Welcome back to Just Blazor Program. Today we're going to be talking about pre-rendering. Yes, so what is pre-rendering? Pre-rendering is basically a way to get around Blazor WebAssembly's initial load problem. So in case you don't know, Blazor WebAssembly suffers from a very noticeable issue on startup. Whenever you go onto your website that's a Blazor WebAssembly site, there's usually some amount of loading that has to be done in order to have the WebAssembly components be in the browser. And then after that, things are usually fairly quick. But that one-time amount of loading is a lot more noticeable for Blazor WebAssembly than other frameworks. And that is a bit of an issue, both because it makes your website look slow, and that's not good for business, and also makes your SEO garbage because Google ranks your amount of loading for their SEO calculations or whatever, which is also not good for business. So there are two ways around the Blazor initial load issue. And the first way is having a loading bar, basically a loading circle. And that doesn't really solve the problem, but at least gives the user something to look at while they are, waiting for it. So I don't believe this actually helps in the SEO. I'll get back to you on that. I don't think so though. But another way to go around this problem is through something called pre-rendering. So what does pre-rendering mean? Pre-rendering for a Blazor WebAssembly site, or just like anything in general, is basically that you somehow have a static HTML being shown to your users, your clients, or whatever, and that is gonna essentially be the placeholder of your loading circle. And then they'll be able to look at it or at least interact with it to some minimal degree while everything loads up in the background. So the amount of stuff you can show to them at once really depends on you. So I'm just going to go through a very simple example I found online, which I will put in the description. This is not mine, so I'm going to put that up front. But unfortunately, this person's tutorial, although I really do like it, does explain a lot. It bounces between .NET 5 and .NET 6, so it gets a little confusing. However, what's probably going to be more confusing is the fact that in the second example, we're going to be loading data through the pre-render, because you can still do that. This tutorial will not have anything to do with authentication or authorization. I believe there are still issues with it, and I have not discovered a decent way to show how to fix it yet. I have not really played with the authentication, so just keep that in mind. However, this will at least give you some exposure to how to implement pre-rendering in your Blazor WebAssembly applications, at the very minimum to something very simple. Personally, I don't know if you want to do the whole data stuff, but I can see why you would do it. Like if you want to download specific information for the user up front so they could at least look at that or whatever. But we'll get into all that. So stick for a second while I either show you an intro or an ad. We will see. Is this fun to go through every single time you have a question on Blazor? Do you just want to know how to do a simple syntax thing without going to Google? Well, you can do that with my Blazor cheat sheet. You can just get my Blazor cheat sheet right here at justblazor.com, and as you can see, there's 19 pages of this bad boy and stuff like data binding, event handling, JS interrupts, forms and validations, and lifecycle of all this stuff there. You know what I mean? Just go to justblazor.com, put your name, your email there. Your name can be whatever you want. Your email has to be your email though. But yeah, you'll get that for free. Just submit it there, and then we'll go back to our pre-rendering thing, I guess. So the first thing I'm going to show you is, number one, I already have like basically a Blazor pre-render project ready to go, but we're just going to go create one for ourselves, because I want to show you that there's an actual difference between them, at least when it comes to loading in the browser. So let's do that real quick. We're going to create a new project, and we need a Blazor WebAssembly project for this one. So click Blazor WebAssembly, Blazor Web App, WASM, Prerender. And yes, we're gonna need the ASP.NET Core hosted. We need that there to make sure that we have all the projects ready to go. So we're just gonna load that bad boy up. Go. And the first thing I'm gonna do, I'm just gonna run it to show you what I'm talking about when I say that loading and stuff. So don't take into consideration the loading that actually has to happen when it tries to run it from the Visual Studios. What we care about is what happens when this is trying to load in the browser. So we have this little loading thing here that tells us that there is, there's actual loading happening here. So it will take a minute before it actually loads, and poof, That is your bare basic Blazor WebAssembly project, and you can see that there is some loading happening there. It even shows you that a loading page for it. Now we're going to go to the pre-render project, so you can see that there's an actual noticeable difference. So this is my pre-render project I made before, and we're going to run that. Again, don't take into consideration the Visual Studio trying to run everything. All I care about is the browser. As you can see, the browser did not take any time to load because I'm doing pre-rendering. So this is what we want to have. And it looks identical to it, but trust me, it is not. And there's actually a lot of work that goes behind what's happening here. And I will show you that today. So this is what we kind of want right now. We want to avoid that loading thing. So how do we do that? Well, before I get started, I would like to at least explain to you what is happening and why such a trick is able to be possible. The reason why is because instead of giving the client the all the burden of loading up on the browser, part of it is being given through pre-rendering into the server itself. So in this project, I have this host.ch HTML that actually has a component that kind of deals with it. There's more to it than that. But what I'm saying is that we are offloading the what will be a static HTML to the server, in our project, in our solution. And in here is why it's so quick. So if you notice that Blazor server doesn't actually suffer from any of these issues, that's because of the whole SignalR thing, but everything runs on the server. It is not trying to load up on the browser like WebAssembly is doing. So we're just leveraging that ability to have very temporarily essentially the server taking the burden of showing the stuff on the client side. The problem comes is when you try to load everything back up to the client side, and then there might be some issues there depending on how you build your pre-rendering stuff, but we will address that because the tutorial is actually really good when it comes to the solution for it, which is using services and abstraction, but we'll get into that momentarily. This is a little bit higher as a technical tutorial, I'm not going to lie. So if you have issues with this particular parlance or with what I'm saying, I would go back to the Blazor state project so you can learn how we actually use services. I might make a video in the future because I think that might be something that people will need to understand, how to use services, like there are 3 kinds or whatever, but like scope, transient, blah blah blah. I'll get into that probably in a different video. However, you just have to take my word that we're setting up something so that this can work. So just follow the syntax. And if you just want more information on it, you can go back to my Blazor state video because we're kind of leveraging that kind of logic. So yeah. Anyways, this is the Blazor app. This is the one I just created. So the brand new tutorial that has none of the pre-rendering done is the one we're looking at right now. I just this other one here minimized. Oops, didn't want to press that. So we're going to get rid of that and get rid of that. And yeah, also about my cheat sheet real quick. If you have issues getting it, like if you sign up for it and you're not getting it, just let me know in the comments section. If you could check your spam folder, because I have seen people, get it actually, and I've been verified that they have gotten it. So I need to, if you have an issue with it, let me know. I don't know what's going on there. Anyways, let's get back to the tutorial. And let's talk about, let me grab this real quick, what I'm about to do. So the first thing we want to do is we need to go to our root folder and see this index.html. This is what's actually loading up on the Blazor WebAssembly. This is going to be the HTML that we're going to be moving to the server. So we could just leave it there if you want. There's no real point in getting rid of it. We need to copy and paste this into our server, and we're going to create a brand new file. So before we do all that, I want you to open up a few things. I need you to open up both the program that's not the both of them. I need to open up this one. Yeah, the program.cs file within the server, the index file within the www root. This is going to make sense soon enough. And I need you to also, we don't need to do anything else right now. For now, we're going to leave it very simple. So what I want you to do in this Blazor server is go to where it says pages, and we're going to be adding 2 pages to this. So the first page we're going to be adding is going to be the underscore host. So remember when I said that you were going to need to create a brand new page that's going to be put in the server? This is going to be that page. And this is going to be the thing that the server is going to show. So I'm going to make a new Razor page. It has to say .ch.html at the end of it. This is not a Razor component. This is a Razor page, which is different. ASP.NET page, whatever. We're going to call this underscore host. Technically, you can call it whatever you want, but just make it simple. So what do we do in this page here? First, I want you to leave at page here. Don't just leave that there. And then we're going to put at using the whatever the Blazor, whatever your Blazor project name, and put .client. We're going to need that in a moment. Not right now, though. And then I want you to go to the index.html file that's in the www root and copy paste that in there. Make sure you don't delete those you're at using your app page. You need them to be there. Now in this case, we get rid of the error load stuff. We're not going to need that. And we can get rid of this as well. Because we're going to be replacing it with something else. You're probably going to be wondering like, oh, the loading thing, isn't that the loading thing? Well, yeah, it was, but what's actually happening is this component that we're going to push in there. This persist component state, this is going to be the bread and butter of how to do the pre-rendering on our side. So we don't have to load because we're going to have this static page do the work for us essentially. So yeah, make sure this is in there. Render mode WebAssembly pre-rendered. Make sure you have this component in there. And ensure, you don't even have to do anything up here. Just make sure you have the pre-render component, the persist component state component. This is something new that they put in .NET 6. So if you want to go through the tutorial that I'm putting in the description, it's not going to be in the first two halves. It's going to be in the third half. So that's why I'm just going to, what I'm doing in this video is putting his tutorial all in one, concise spot. So that's all we got to do for the moment on this side. And now we're going to go to program.cs. So I'll make sure to save. This program.cs is the one within the server. And we're going to change this to map fallback to page instead. We're going to comment this out. Now, the one that we're looking at here is called map fallback to file. We don't want that. We want map fallback to page. And then we're going to replace index.html with the name of the page we just created, which in my case is going to be underscore host. I'll put a slash in there. That's going to be the URI, basically. And that should do it for this piece now. So what we've just done is actually made sure that that static file that we're going to call to when it's loading has the component state component, which is going to handle something else. And if something fails here, it's going to go back instead of the index.html page that we had up here. We're going to go back to our server to do the whole pre-rendering stuff. So apart from that, what I need you guys to do is go to, we need to build another file actually. And then I'll explain this in a little bit, what we're doing with this, but we do need this other thing. So we're going to create a new Razor page again. And this time we're going to call it underscore view imports. And we don't need, we can change this out. We don't need that. We don't need the at page. We do need to have an at using Blazor, whatever it is, dot server. Then down here, we need a namespace. Same thing. Dot server.pages, we can get rid of this piece here. And then we're gonna add this in here. Just copy what I'm doing here. Add tag helper, Microsoft ASP.NET Core MVC tag helpers. So this is gonna be something that I'm gonna get into a little bit later. Just add it now since we're still in the same place. These tag helpers are basically an ASP.NET thing where it's like pre-made HTML, but you don't really have to know too much more than that. So the next step after this is to go to our fetch data, I believe. Yeah, we're gonna add fetch data to it at some point. So that is gonna be the thing that we're gonna add. So give me a second. So yeah, go to fetch data because we're gonna be using that for demonstrating how to get data within the pre-render. So I'm just gonna set all this up because right now our pre-rendering is there. What is not there is how this is gonna get set up. So we have our inject HTTP. I want you to copy these 2 lines of code. Persistent component state, application state, and disposable. So what is this? Persistent component state here is essentially just because we're going to be bringing in this fetch data within our pre-render stuff, we need to know when we have data to show. So that's why it's in this persistent component state. So this is what we kind of want to do. I'll get into it once we get into writing the actual code stuff here, so you know what exactly I'm talking about, because right now it's probably not making much sense to you. But what it is gonna do is make sure that that you could essentially just store and retrieve data. That's all you have to do. Sorry about that. Yeah, all you have to do is add this there to store and retrieve data. So essentially, it's kind of like it's maintaining a state for this, which is why I said you should probably go back to my state management tutorial to understand a little bit more. But that is essentially what we're doing. There's more to this later on, but I also want to show you an issue that this has when it comes to using this method, or at least a portion of the method. There is a solution to it, but I'm just warning you now, this is not complete when it comes to data. So the first thing we're going to need to replace this piece with these things. So if you don't know what a subscription is basically that we are essentially listening to this data that's being saved. So this goes with the whole service piece in the program.cs file. We haven't done that just yet, but we will. So what I want you guys to do is add these 2 functions first before we get into this one. Persist forecast private task, and the application state persists as JSON fetch data forecast. So what we're doing here is we're basically just getting I'll just read to you what it does. I'm gonna go peak definition here. So this is a bit special. It's basically doing a retrieval of data of JSON, except it's gonna put it within the state. So there's a very specific function just for this when it comes to JSON objects. So our fetch data is a JSON object essentially. But because we're doing it in the pre-render, because we have a state that we want to keep track of, we need to use this specific function from that application state to do this. So that's why you need that, and you need to dispose with the subscription, because anytime you make a subscription, you have to basically tell it to shut off, or else you might cause like a memory leak or something like that. Essentially, you're in charge of trying to get rid of this at some point. It has to do with how we subscribe to get information from stateful data. That's a whole different thing altogether. I know this is probably still not making a lot of sense here, but just know that when it comes to doing stuff within state, it is a little bit different than when you're doing things normally, especially because this is a process that happens before the actual load of anything that comes into your project. So in this case, this is going to change. So this is where we're actually going to do the subscription piece. So here we have our application state where we do the, we actually get the data, and that is what goes into our subscription. And then we have to actually see whether or not we have this data, or else we have to grab the data. So if you don't have the data available to you now, I need to grab it. If not, then I will use whatever is stored within the state. That is how statefulness works. So to do that, I'm just going to copy paste it from what I have here, and I'm going to explain to you what's happening. So remember when I said that when it comes to statefulness, we need different functions? Well, in our application state, we have another one called try take from JSON, and it tries to see whether or not we already have this JSON object stored. If not, we'll try to grab it from doing this HTTP call. Now, this is going to be a problem when it comes to our pre-rendering, specifically because this is happening in the server, which is a little bit weird that we're doing HTTP call in the server. But I will show you, once we've completed all this, why that is kind of strange and why we shouldn't be doing that. But for now, this is fine. It's going to actually work. What we have done so far is made sure that, number one, I'll get into this a little bit later. Number one, we have our persistent component state ready. So this is going to be this is the thing that in .NET 6 prevents a certain problem that happens in .NET 5, where when we try to do implementing a pre-rendering, it will call the initialize twice. And this is basically just setting up the pre-rendering for us so it doesn't do that. And in our program.cs file, we have our map fallback page. Instead of hitting the index.html that is within the www root folder, we want it to be our host with it, or the host file we've just created that has all that information. The one I just showed you here that has the persistent component state. We're using that instead as our fallback file in case things need to be redirected. And we don't need that anymore. And our fetch data has been changed. Number one, in order to make sure, because what we're doing actually with this pre-render is we're going to pre-render the whole, all our components. There's not that many components to do this pre-rendering stuff, so it's not going to be much of a burden. So it's okay to do it like this, but when it comes to like bigger projects, I think you have to decide what you want to show to the user at a time. So in this case, we're adding the persistent component state. So I'm just going to go to the definition real quick. Persistent component subscription. And then down the line, we're using the persistent component subscription. Yeah, state subscription in order to register the component state and its data, basically. That's what that means. And the iDisposable is that anytime you do a subscription to anything in state, you want to dispose of that after it's done, or else you can it causes a problem. Within the onInitialized async, so when this thing begins, essentially when the page loads, we want to do this whole logic. We register our data to whatever is within that JSON. In this case, it is the logic of whatever the it is this logic here. Let me see if I could go to it. WeatherForecast. Where is it? Here is this logic right here. So this logic, normally what would happen is that you have maybe a database call that will retrieve the logic for you. In this case, the logic is being done within a controller. So this is basically the endpoint. And we're just creating the data within the server. That normally is not going to be the case. It's going to be usually a call to the database, but in lieu of having all that set up, we're going to be using this as a way to take data from somewhere. So yeah, we have dispose subscription. This will tell you whether or not the application has data. Basically, if there is data, use whatever has been stored. If there isn't, we'll call the HTTP request up here, which will be a problem. But I believe this is all you need right now for having this pre-render to, to actually, you can see that there's some pre-rendering happening. So we have our pre-render. Our components work. This also works. So, pretty good, right? You know how we know whether or not this is actually being pre-rendered? If we go to the inspector, go to the console, we'll see an error happening. So this error is happening because the application is actually trying to hit somewhere else. Even though we're telling it to hit our host file, there's another place we have to make this change to. So we could fix this error pretty easy. I'm going to show you how to change it right now. But this is not the problem I'm talking about. I'm talking about a bigger issue than this. But let's fix this problem first. Let's go to our program.cs of the client side. And don't worry, I'm going to explain a little bit more about this process with some more visual aids that I could, go to the next step, which is going to be a little bit more complicated than this. So if I go to the program.cs file here, what's actually happening is this is the problem here. This roots component.add app, this is trying to basically hit it's basically hitting the original app file, but we don't want it to do that. We want it to just let our host file be the one that it hits for the pre-render. So we can remove that, and that will remove it from the case. This is actually what happens when you load the client. It hits here, and then it does everything afterwards. But we don't need to do that anymore because we have our host. So once we run it like this, it will eliminate that error. Have that, go here. And if I go to the inspector, boom, there is no error. So there is no error anymore because we got rid of that one line within the program.cs of the client side. And now I'm going to show you where there is still an error. So imagine that, fantastic. We have our pre-rendering working. It's not hitting the client side anymore when it starts up because we removed that one line. We have it hitting our host file. So, that means everything should work just fine, right? Well, watch this. Let's say your user wants to just refresh the page. Uh-oh. What happened here? Well, this is what happened. The HTTP client, the thing that I was warning you about, that is a problem. And I'll explain that problem in a bit, because now this comes to the harder portion of our setting up of our pre-rendering. Basically, if you don't have data to set up, you're basically okay doing this. But if there is data that you want to set up within the pre-rendering, like in this case, we want the fetch data to be set up, then there's a little bit of an extra step you have to go through, which involves abstracting that process between the client and the server. But don't worry, I'll get into that in a moment after maybe an ad or something. I don't know. Well, I hope you enjoyed that ad, if there was an ad. If not, then it probably was jarring that I skipped to this point. But what essentially I did, I shut down the project because you already saw that we had an error within the HTTP client. And I'm going to explain to you what's happening. So what is going on is that usually within your project, especially when it's a Blazor WebAssembly project, or with any any of the modern frameworks that has this kind of architecture, there's usually a front end and then there's a back end. So the front end has to make calls to the back end. In this case, the client is our front end and our back end is our server. So this is our front end. Here's our back end. And in order for the client, the front end, to make our calls, we need to make HTTP calls. So in this case, that's what HTTP client is handling. HTTP client is just a class in .NET that handles the URL stuff, basically, for your client. And then what it's trying to do is hit an endpoint. Endpoints are, in this case, would be the controller for the weather forecast data. So here is our weather forecast data. weather forecast controller. It is trying to access this through that HTTP client. If it cannot find the data, which is when you refresh it, it's going to hit there, and it's not registered. So what is happening is that because the pre-rendering component, let's have this here, pre-render. What's happening here is that the pre-render is actually being all done within the server. So we have that logic HTTP client trying to be done within the pre-render here, and that doesn't make any sense. For one, we shouldn't be doing HTTP client calls within the server itself. This should be done in a different way. And number two, because this is pre-rendered, we are skipping a step basically. So what happens is that the pre-render will happen first. So forget about that real quick. The pre-render is going to happen, and then I'm just going to write load normal. And then your application is going to load normally. However, when it loads normally, then basically everything works the way you expect it to work. An HTTP client will be in the client side, and it will do all the calls that it will do and that it has to do, and then everything works fine. But because we are skipping that step, this pre-render step is special. It is a static page that was created by this server, so it doesn't follow the normal processes. So in order for you to actually have access to data or to make data calls, we have to have it registered within the pre-render. So in theory, you could have this HTTP client registered, having the whole subscription, having the service, doing everything I'm about to show you right now after I explain this. You could technically have this ready for the pre-render, but we shouldn't be doing that because number one, this HTTP client should only really be done within the client side, because there's no reason why we should have client calls within the server trying to hit server endpoints. There's a better way of doing this, and we shouldn't have this here basically. So that is what's happening. That's why this is breaking. So just to recap, the clients usually make an HTTP request to the server because the server has something called an endpoint that we want to access, like data or whatever, and that is usually done by the HTTP client. However, because of the pre-render happens within the server, so we can't have that HTTP client call for one thing, because it doesn't make much sense, and number two, because we have nothing registered. In order for us to have access to anything within the pre-render that is data related, we need it to be registered, aka we have to have it as a service available to the pre-render, because it's being done in a different way before it loads normally everything else that we need to load, and then at that point everything works as you expect it to work. So that is the explanation to what's happening, in case you were confused. Hopefully they didn't confuse you too much. So what will be the solution to this problem? In order for us to actually have our pre-rendering work with data calls like this, we need to create an abstraction. So remember when I mentioned that we could have it as a service for the HTTP client. Instead, we're going to have the weather controller or the weather forecast logic, have that as the service and abstract them between the client and the server side. So what that means that instead of having this, what do you call it? Go back to it. Instead of having this be a thing that we assign to the pre-render, that we subscribe to, that we have a service for it, we're not going to do that. We're going to create an abstraction with the weather service logic itself between the client and the server, because we need them on both halves, because that's how this is going to work. And have that handle the HTTP client call within the client side when it needs to, and then have this call happen within the server, and then allow that to basically not step on the other one's toes because it has been abstracted. And if that doesn't make sense, basically, do I have this thing still? Yeah. This is what we're doing. We're gonna basically creating, when I say abstracting it, we're creating the logic so that it works correctly on the client side and that it works correctly on the server side when it needs to. The reason why we need to do that is because the pre-render is done in the server side, and then when that happens and it refreshes, we want it to work like it would work normally in the client side. which is why even that this looks a little bit weird doing it like this, but that's essentially the explanation as to why we need to abstract the data so that we could use the service during the pre-render and then have this available for the client side once the pre-render is no longer needed. So hopefully that clears it up a little bit more, but I know it is a lot. Working with state is a bit of a it's a bit of a meh process, and I could do a better job explaining it, but that is the gist of it, and we still have to do the actual you know, making the weather service abstracting the data. So this is going to be the more annoying part of all this. And if you want, I already did create the Blazor state stuff. I created a Blazor state video on this. However, if you want me to go into the actual service and all that stuff more, you just let me know, because this might be confusing. It sounds confusing when I listen to myself say this, but I promise you that is important, first of all. And second of all, what we're doing is basically making sure that we have access to data during some parts of the process. And this is how .NET does it. So the first things we're going to have to do in the client and in the service, in the server projects, we're going to be creating a directory. One directory in the client and one directory in the server, and they're going to be called the same thing. We're going to call them data. That's going to be the first thing we're going to do. Easy peasy. We're just going to be adding a new folder. This new folder in this case is going to be called just data. We're going to do the same thing here. Let me see. Is it data? No. Okay. We're going to add a new folder here. We're going to call this data. Starting it off easy. Also, for the Blazor server, we have the controller there. Perfect. All right. Okay. So data is done. So what we're going to do now is we're actually going to create the new service that we're going to attach to everything. So that is going to be the next step. We're going to create service. So the very, very first thing is that I want to move some of this information out. So you see this controller? This controller has all the data basically. Like where in a normal process that isn't just, a project file that was created for a tutorial, what would happen is that we'll be getting the data, aka the database calls and stuff. We're going to be moving that somewhere else. So instead of it being here in this controller is going to be working a little bit differently. We're going to be moving that to our data project. So we're going to move, this is a form of it. We're going to be abstracting it to our new service that we're going to register during the pre-rendering process. In order to do that, we're going to create a new file. This time is a CS file. Come on. Class file. Give me a second while I cheat on my other monitor. All right. So yeah, we want to create a new weather service file here. Just WeatherForecast service. That's what this is called. We are also going to need to create a weather forecast service file for the data that's up here as well. So go to the data folder that's in the client side and do the same thing. And we're not going to work on it just yet, because what we need is to add something. So this remains the same, the model. The model isn't shared, but we're going to add an interface within the shared folder. The shared project, my bad. And this will be the thing that they're both going to inherit from. So this time we're going to be adding a new add. I can't do it. I want to add a new interface in this case. And this interface is going to be called the iWeather service. Weather forecast service. That is what it's called because that's what it's called. iWeatherForecast service. Perfect. And this interface will be shared between both of the services that are within the server and the client. So that's why I need to have this here. And all this is going to have is just this one function within it. Ask weather's forecast service get forecast async. So this is going to be just the one thing they both need to have in order for them to work. And the only expectation that we have. So for both of them, we want to add them as, well, first of all, we need to grab the shared project. So give me one moment. Grab the right one. Okay. First thing we need are the @using stuff, basically. Yeah, that's fine. Oh no, that's right. This is not called that. We need to have access to that library. They need to have access to the interface. Blazor app WASM Prerender. This should be fine. And now we add our make sure you make it public. I always forget that. There you go. Now we have this. So we need to create that get forecast stuff. So where we're going to get that information from, we're going to get it from wherever it came from originally, which is in the controller. So this controller was doing all the work. We want to move this data from the controller to over there. So we're just going to take this essentially. Go from here down to here. We'll come back to this later. And we're going to go back to our weather forecast service within our server. I'm just going to paste that in here. Get rid of this HTTP get. Get rid of this controller piece here. Get rid of the logger. And instead of this being a get, we're going to copy the function we just created in that interface, which is get forecast async. And hopefully that will do it. Unless this get forecast async is also wrong. I think it should be fine. What's wrong here? Oh, did I not add this to it? Public async. There you go. So I just had to change the return type and change that to what we called get forecast async, and just have the data in there. Just remove the egregious stuff from the controllers that we didn't need and just leave this as it was. This will basically act the exact same way. So now what we've done is we've moved the logic, the actual grabbing. We're creating logic because that's how this project works. But what will normally happen is that in here, we're actually going to be grabbing the data in any other project. In this case, we're trying to do the same thing, except we're just creating it within the server. So this is basically the database call, more or less. You want to think of it that way. And within that controller, let's go back to it before I forget. Where is it? I don't need the model. We don't need the interface anymore. This is the client one. I don't need that. That's the one we just did. Here's the controller. Here's the one we ripped out all the data from. So the first thing we need to do is make sure that we have our shared we have access to our shared project. We have the interfaces. We're gonna need it in a second, like this. Primary only I4. Okay, so did I spell it wrong? Hey, we ate her. Oh, I spelled that as 4 case. I hate when I do that. I hope some of you were yelling at the screen. You should put it in the comments section and tell me that I spelt it wrong. So yes, we gotta. I'm gonna just fix that, and you should fix it too. I'm gonna rename that to Forecast. Yes, please. And that should fix everything. WeatherForecast service. And we didn't do anything there. WeatherForecast service. Spelled correctly this time. We haven't done anything there yet. WeatherForecast service. Okay. So good. I finally fixed it. I knew there was something wrong, but I just didn't see what it was. Now we're gonna go to our constructor. That out. I want you to write this. Put our WeatherForecast service in there. Make sure that the object is in the you need to do this basically. And I'm sorry, it's late for me. It's pretty late for me right now, but we'll get through this. And then we're gonna have to replace the get call with this get call. So now we are hitting our weather service for that for the data instead. So we're now abstracting it. The next step we need to do is the same thing but on the client side. So our server side stuff has been done, and now we will do the client side. And for our client side, luckily we have this there. We have our weather forecast service here. We need to also make sure that we bring in the our shared project, and make sure you have the right name for it. And then you're gonna need this one. I don't think you need the task or the HTTP one. I just have them there usually. Do you need the JSON one and the shared one though? Oh, and also make sure you are inheriting from the WeatherForecast 4case, whatever. And here is where we're gonna move the HTTP client call. So we're no longer gonna have our client call within the fetch data. We're not gonna have this HTTP stuff in here. We're gonna move it to our client side within a class instead. So what I need you to do for that, I'm gonna have this in there. It's kind of strange that this isn't activating, but whatever. Have our constructor again. And then finally invoke the method that we need to invoke, the getForecast method, since we're inheriting from this interface here. And that should be fine. Doesn't matter if it's null. It works. .NET and nullables now is kind of a pain in the butt, but we'll get through it together. So basically, we're going to be moving the HTTP client code away from the weather forecast and move it to the class weather forecast service within client. So remember when I said in that example that we need basically 2 weather forecast objects to be represented in the server and the client side? Well, that's what we're kind of doing here. We are abstracting all this so that each side has their own weather forecast way of handling it, essentially. And then finally, we need to register our service, which will go to our programs, both of them. We need to go to both program files. So in this case, This is the client side program, and I need the so what I'm doing is, because I already had them out, what you need to do is go to both the program.cs file on the client and the program.cs file in the server, because we need to now register them. So here's how I'm gonna start with the client side here real quick. So right under this add scoped HTTP client, we're gonna add this there because we are using that client. Also, we need to add the shared. Yeah, we need to add that too as well. We need to add the .data because this is the client sides, and that stuff is in the weather forecast services within our data. The classes within the data directory, and not only that, we need to grab our shared as well for the weather forecast for the interface itself. And we're going to be doing something very similar on the other side as well. This is program.cs to the server. So this one here within the server project, we're going to be doing the same thing. And the way to do that one is, again, you need to have access to the object within the data directory, and you need to make sure that you have access to the shared directory down here. So over here, make sure that you got the right name in here. So we have the name of our solution.server.data.shared as well. And then we're just going to be adding it where all the services are. So it's the exact same thing, except it's builder.services. Or in this case, builder.services as scope. So it's the same thing. Builder.services, perfect. Builder.services as scoped the interface and the class weather forecast service. Now we're not done yet because we still need to fix the fetch data class. We're still using this HTTP thing. We have to now get rid of that and exchange that for the weather forecast one. And how do we do that? Well, you give me a second while I pull up the file. While I pull up the answer. First, we got to get our weather forecast service in there and get rid of this. We don't need HTTP client anymore, but we will inject our service in here. So we can get rid of that, replace our HTTP client with that. We'll only be needing that. And then we're going to be fixing that right now. So instead of await whatever this is, we get rid of all of that. And now we're going to replace it with the weather forecast service that we have injected. .get forecast async. Now this get forecast async. I'll give you a second to look at it. Await weather forecast service .get forecast async, and this is the one on the server side. Oh, there's two of them. But this fetch data. Wait, where is this fetch data actually? Oh, it's in here. It was gonna be the one that's here. Oh no, this is just our interface. My bad. I'm sorry. I'm a little tired. But anyways, we have finally created our weather forecast service. The client side is going to be getting the one that was registered within the program.cs of the client side, and the same thing with the server side. So when the pre-render actually happens, it will do the correct call. So that's why we want this interface. That's when I'm saying abstraction, I mean that it isn't completely focused on like it doesn't matter whether or not it's being called from the server. In this case, what this means is that it doesn't care whether it's the server or the client. It's going to run the correct logic. That's why we need to register the service on both the program.cs files on the client and the server, because when the server makes its pre-render, it's going to get the one that's coming from the program.cs service that was registered to it in the server side. And when the client side finally kicks in, it's going to get the one that that gets it from the client side. That's what the abstraction is for. So now we've gone over the issue with the HTTP client being called within the server. Now we're not doing that anymore because the server call is going to be limited to the server weather forecast service, while the client one will have the client one. And that is why we need abstraction. And if you don't understand what abstraction is, it's really important to learn .NET, because this is how we reuse and avoid problems when it comes to setting up concrete examples. So that's why we don't need the HTTP client anymore in this fetch data, because we are still using it when the time is right, when the client gets called. And when the server gets called, we're not using it. We're using the server calls instead. So let's see how that works. Did I forget something? We'll find out in a second. Hope I didn't forget. And yes, this is a lot. And poof, there you go. It worked. Fantastic. Or did it? So right now, we have our weather forecast. And now we're going to reload it. Oh my goodness, it worked. And yeah, this is fine. I expect the data to keep changing because we're making these calls over and over again. But hey, that's how you do pre-rendering. Basically, you're not going to see that crazy amount of a difference when you're doing it like this, because I'm just pre-rendering basically the whole thing over and over again. So it's hard for you to actually see a difference. What you will see a difference is when there's a lot of stuff to load, and then when you actually have like a small piece of your program being loaded so that a user can see it, and then when everything gets loaded finally at the end of it, you will finally see that difference, and you'll see it's a bigger difference than what we see now. However, I do think this is noticeable, the fact that it's basically lightning fast to do all this, because in the background we are doing loading. We are just keeping things in state until we are ready to go and let the client do whatever it has to do, because the client has not been loaded yet. So that is how pre-rendering works, and that's how this specific tutorial works. What I've done is essentially taken all the .NET 5 stuff and .NET 6 stuff and put it in a tutorial that makes sense going down the line. You could always read it on his end, but there's stuff that you don't need anymore because he was using .NET 5 stuff and a .NET 5 workaround, which you do not need. I did not show you this because there was no point. And in .NET 6, the most important thing for you to understand is this piece, this persist component state. And I believe he does talk about this view import stuff here. I think I forgot to talk about it. So I'll just go over it in a moment, because I need to remember. Oh, I know. Yeah, so apparently this view, you need this in order for it to work, is because if you don't, you're just gonna see it's not gonna load correctly. So what you need is these tag helpers in order for you to load all this stuff correctly. Essentially, that's why you need it. There's more to it. I think he does go into it and explain why, but I don't think it's that important. Just add the view imports if you find yourself having an issue. So yeah, I think the most important thing between .NET 5 and .NET 6 is actually this component here, persist component state, which allows us to use this host.ch HTML, and it also gets around a problem that .NET 5 had, which is that whenever you start pre-rendering things, it will call the onInitialize async twice, and that what happens then is that you're basically loading the page twice. You don't want to do that. So that fixes the problem for .NET 5. We don't have that problem now using this convention, using the right component in there. And yeah, this is a lot. This works a lot with state management, and I would love to make a video going into state management, especially when it comes to Blazor, because I think that's really, really important. And you let me know if you want that. If not, then you let me know whatever it is that you do want. And if you enjoy this tutorial, let me know. I cannot get credit for this. The only thing I did was streamline it more Like if you can think, yeah, I know about the video, but all I really did was try to explain the parts that that he didn't really explain, and all I did was put the .NET 5 and .NET 6 parts in a way that makes sense, so that you don't have to jump around between all the pages like I had to do. So yeah, this was interesting, and this is a way around the whole pre-rendering issue. So you have the ability to do pre-rendering with or without data, and the first half of this whole thing was without the data portion working, and the second half of this is to make data work because you have subscribed to a service within the pre-rendering pages. So again, you're probably not going to see too much of a difference between this and a normally loaded page because there's nothing too different, but on bigger projects you will see a difference. And just remember that if you are trying to load data within a pre-render for pre-rendering, that there has to be an abstraction when you call data, so that the client and the server are both accessing the right places at the right time, essentially. So yeah, I think that's it. Thank you very much, and don't forget about my cheat sheet and all that good stuff. Thank you very much. Peace out.